They insult you. They provoke you. They try to pull you into emotional reaction. And in that moment, everything depends on one decision. Not what you say. Not what you do. But whether you react at all. Because Machiavelli understood something dangerous. The person who reacts loses control. And the person who loses control loses power. The philosophy of non-reaction. Most people believe power is shown through response, through defense, through explanation, through emotional expression. They are wrong. Power is shown through restraint. Machiavelli observed this in princes, generals, and rulers. He wrote, "Men respect the one who cannot be manipulated. And manipulation always begins with reaction. Reaction gives your enemy information. Reaction reveals your emotional triggers. Reaction exposes your weaknesses. Every reaction is a confession. A confession of what controls you. A confession of where you are vulnerable. This is why emotional people are easily controlled. They reveal everything without realizing it. But the one who does not react remains a mystery. And mystery is power. Why people try to provoke you? Understand this clearly. Provocation is never random. It is always strategic. Consciously or unconsciously. When someone provokes you, they are attempting one of three things. To control your emotions. To lower your status. To expose your insecurity. Because the moment you react emotionally, they achieve all three. You surrender control. You lower your authority. You expose your internal state. And they rise above you psychologically. Even if they say nothing afterward. Even if they pretend it was a joke. The damage is already done. Machiavelli warned. Never give your enemy the satisfaction of your reaction. Because reaction is submission. Trick 1, the discipline of emotional neutrality. This is the first dark psychology trick. And the most foundational. Emotional neutrality. Not emotional suppression. Emotional neutrality. There is a difference. Suppression is internal chaos forced into silence. Neutrality is internal control. True calm. True stillness. When someone insults you, and you remain calm, you create psychological imbalance. They expect reaction. They prepare for defense. They anticipate emotional movement. And when it never comes, they become uncomfortable, uncertain, even afraid. Because now, they cannot read you. And what cannot be read cannot be controlled. Tactical execution, emotional neutrality. The next time someone provokes you, do nothing. No facial change. No verbal response. No defensive explanation. Just calm observation. Look at them. As if you are studying them. Not reacting to them. This single act shifts the entire power dynamic. Because now, they are exposed. And you are not. They become the emotional one. They become the reactive one. They become the weak one. Without you saying a single word. The psychological effect of silence. Silence is not empty. Silence is pressure. Silence forces the other person to confront uncertainty. And uncertainty creates discomfort. The human brain seeks resolution. When resolution does not come, it creates anxiety. This is why silence intimidates. This is why silence dominates. This is why silence wins. Machiavelli wrote, "He who speaks less is heard more." Because silence increases perceived strength, while reaction decreases it. Trick 2, never explain yourself. This is where most people destroy their power. They explain. They justify. They defend. They attempt to make others understand. This is a mistake. Explanation is submission disguised as communication. Because explanation places the other person above you. It positions them as the judge. And you as the one seeking approval. Power never seeks approval. Power assumes authority. When you explain yourself unnecessarily, you lower your status. You signal uncertainty. You signal insecurity. You signal weakness. Even if your explanation is logical, even if your explanation is correct, the act itself weakens you. Machiavelli warned rulers never to justify themselves emotionally, because authority that explains itself invites challenge. Authority that remains silent ends discussion. Tactical execution, refusing explanation. When someone questions your decision, do not over-explain. Simply state, it is handled. Nothing more. No justification. No emotional tone. Just calm finality. This closes the psychological door. It signals certainty. And certainty ends resistance. Because people challenge uncertainty, not certainty. Trick 3. Strategic ignoring. This is the most misunderstood weapon. Ignoring is not weakness. Ignoring is selective attention. And attention is power. What you give attention to, you give power to. What you ignore, you weaken. Provocateurs survive on attention. They seek emotional reaction. They seek engagement. They seek recognition. When you ignore them completely, you remove their fuel. And without fuel, their behavior collapses. Machiavelli understood. What is ignored loses influence. Not immediately, but inevitably. Tactical execution, strategic ignoring. When someone attempts to provoke you repeatedly, do not confront them emotionally. Do not defend yourself. Do not engage unnecessarily. Simply continue your behavior as if nothing happened. Calm, unbothered, unaffected. This communicates something powerful. They do not control you. They do not affect you. They do not exist in your psychological world. This destroys their perceived dominance. Because dominance requires recognition. And you have removed it. The hidden psychological shift. At first, they will try harder. They will increase provocation, increase pressure, increase emotional intensity. This is predictable. This is expected. This is the extinction phase. When manipulation stops working, manipulators escalate. But if you remain consistent, they eventually stop. Because the reward is gone. And behavior without reward dies. The identity shift. This is where transformation begins. You stop reacting. You stop explaining. You stop engaging unnecessarily. And something changes. Not in them. In you. You begin to feel different. Calmer. Stronger. Detached. In control. Because you are no longer controlled by external stimuli. You are controlled by internal discipline. Machiavelli called this mastery. Mastery over self. Mastery over perception. Mastery over power. The new perception others see. People begin to notice. They sense your calm. They sense your restraint. They sense your emotional independence. And they adjust their behavior. Not because you demanded respect, but because your behavior trained them to respect you. Respect is not requested. Respect is conditioned. Through consistent emotional control. Through consistent silence. Through consistent non-reaction. The deeper Machiavellian tricks have not yet been revealed. Because silence is only the foundation, not the weapon. Silence removes their control. But unpredictability destroys their confidence completely. Trick 4. Become psychologically unpredictable. Human beings are comforted by patterns. Patterns create predictability. Predictability creates control. If someone can predict your reactions, they can manipulate your behavior. They know when you will defend yourself. They know when you will become emotional. They know when you will break. And this knowledge gives them power. Machiavelli warned rulers never to be easily predictable, because predictability invites strategy against you. But unpredictability creates hesitation, creates uncertainty, creates fear. The hidden psychology of unpredictability. The mind constantly tries to anticipate outcomes. It asks, what will he do next? What will he say next? How will he react? But when no clear pattern exists, the mind cannot prepare. And when the mind cannot prepare, it becomes cautious. This caution is submission, because hesitation is the opposite of dominance. Dominant individuals are not easily read. They are not easily understood. They are not easily predicted. And because of this, they are rarely challenged. Tactical execution, controlled unpredictability. This does not mean acting randomly. Randomness is chaos. Chaos is weakness. This means acting deliberately, but refusing to follow emotional expectations. For example, someone insults you expecting anger. Instead, you remain calm. Another time, you ignore them completely. Another time, you respond briefly and neutrally. No emotional pattern. No predictable script. No emotional consistency they can study. Only controlled variation. This forces them into psychological uncertainty. They begin to question themselves. They begin to hesitate. They begin to withdraw. Not because you attack them, but because they cannot understand you. And what cannot be understood cannot be controlled. The identity shift that occurs. This is where your power begins to evolve. You stop being emotionally accessible. You stop being psychologically readable. You stop being predictable. And people feel it. They sense something has changed. They sense distance. They sense authority. Even if they cannot explain why. Because emotional unpredictability signals independence. And independence signals strength. Trick 5. Emotional detachment. This is where true power begins. Not when you control your actions, but when you control your emotional attachment to outcomes. Most people react because they care too much about perception. They care too much about approval. They care too much about being understood. This emotional dependence is their weakness. Because whoever controls your emotions controls you. Machiavelli wrote that a prince must learn not to be controlled by sentiment. Because sentiment clouds judgment. Sentiment creates vulnerability. Sentiment creates hesitation. Power requires clarity. Clarity requires detachment. The psychological freedom of detachment. When you are emotionally detached, insults lose their impact. Criticism loses its pressure. Provocation loses its influence. Because your emotional state is no longer dependent on external behavior. It is dependent on internal control. You no longer react to protect your ego. You act only when it serves your strategy. This makes you dangerous. Because emotional people are predictable. Detached people are not. Tactical execution, practicing emotional detachment. The next time someone attempts to provoke you, observe your emotional impulse. Observe the urge to react. Observe the urge to defend yourself. And then, do nothing. Let the impulse pass. Do not obey it. Because emotional impulse is not authority. It is programming. Programming designed by social conditioning. Programming designed by ego. Programming designed by fear. You are not required to obey it. You are only required to observe it. And in observation, you regain control. The psychological effect others experience. When someone cannot affect you emotionally, they lose their primary weapon. They may try harder, increase intensity, increase frequency. But when nothing works, they experience psychological defeat. Because their influence has collapsed. They are no longer interacting with your emotions. They are interacting with your discipline. And discipline cannot be manipulated. The silent status elevation. Something else begins to happen. Something subtle. Something powerful. People begin to respect you differently. Not because you demanded it, but because your behavior demonstrated it. They stop testing you. They stop provoking you. They stop attempting emotional control. Because they sense resistance is useless. Machiavelli understood. Respect is not granted to the emotional. Respect is granted to the controlled. Because control signals strength. And strength discourages challenge. Trick 6. Strategic absence. This is where your power multiplies. Because presence creates familiarity. And familiarity reduces perceived value. But absence creates uncertainty. Creates curiosity. Creates psychological weight. Machiavelli advised leaders not to be constantly accessible. Because constant accessibility reduces authority. Scarcity increases value. Distance increases respect. Absence increases perceived power. Tactical execution, strategic absence. This does not mean disappearing completely. It means reducing unnecessary presence. Reducing unnecessary availability. Reducing unnecessary engagement. Speak less. Appear less. Engage less. But when you do engage, be calm. Be controlled. Be deliberate. This creates psychological contrast. And contrast creates impact. Because rarity increases perceived importance. The psychological vacuum effect. When you are always present, people adapt to your presence. They take it for granted. But when your presence becomes selective, your absence becomes noticeable. And what is noticed becomes significant. They begin to wonder, why is he silent? Why is he distant? Why is he unaffected? And this curiosity increases your psychological authority. Without effort. Without confrontation. Without explanation. They imagine transformation. At this stage, you are no longer the same person. You no longer react automatically. You no longer explain unnecessarily. You no longer engage emotionally without purpose. You have become selective, controlled, deliberate. And people feel it, even if they never mention it. Because behavior communicates more than words. And controlled behavior communicates power. The final trick approaches. But there is one final level. The most dangerous level. The level where you no longer merely avoid manipulation. You become immune to it completely. And once this level is reached, people stop attempting to control you at all. Because they recognize something unmistakable. Something undeniable. Something Machiavelli himself feared and respected. A person who cannot be emotionally moved, cannot be psychologically defeated. But Machiavelli understood something even deeper. The ultimate power is not merely resisting manipulation. It is becoming invisible to it. Because what cannot be engaged cannot be controlled. And what cannot be controlled is abandoned. Trick 7. Psychological invisibility. Most people try to win. They try to prove themselves. They try to respond in ways that establish dominance. This is a mistake. Because engagement, even dominant engagement, still creates connection. And connection creates vulnerability. Machiavelli's final trick is different. He advised leaders to become psychologically unavailable when necessary. Not physically absent. Psychologically absent. Present in body. Absent in emotional accessibility. Because when there is nothing to engage, there is nothing to attack. The hidden weakness of emotional presence. Every time you react emotionally, you confirm accessibility. You confirm influence. You confirm vulnerability. Even confidence. When emotionally expressed too openly, creates access points. But psychological invisibility removes those access points. You become present, but unreachable. Seen, but unfelt. Observed, but not understood. And this creates the ultimate defensive war. Tactical execution, psychological invisibility. When someone attempts emotional manipulation, do not confront. Do not defend. Do not correct. Simply continue your behavior as if the attempt has no psychological relevance. Not as performance. As reality. Because true invisibility cannot be faked. It must be internalized. Their words pass through you. Without resistance. Without engagement. Without affect. And when this happens repeatedly, they begin to disappear from your psychological world. Not physically. Psychologically. And this is where their influence dies. The extinction of manipulation. Manipulators survive on reinforcement. They provoke. You react. They learn. They repeat. This is the cycle. But when reaction disappears, learning disappears. And when learning disappears, behavior collapses. Because there is no reward. No confirmation. No influence. Only silence. Only indifference. Only psychological emptiness. And the human mind cannot tolerate permanent irrelevance. So eventually, they stop trying. Not because they respect you emotionally, but because they cannot reach you psychologically. The shift in perceived hierarchy. This is where the power dynamic permanently changes. Before, they saw you as emotionally accessible. Now, they see you as emotionally independent. Before, they believed they could affect you. Now, they are uncertain. And uncertainty creates caution. Caution creates distance. Distance creates hierarchy. Without confrontation. Without explanation. Without effort. You rise. They retreat. Silently. The internal transformation. But the greatest change is not external. It is internal. You begin to experience emotional autonomy. Freedom from automatic reaction. Freedom from emotional dependence. Freedom from the need to be understood. You no longer react to protect identity. You no longer explain to protect ego. You no longer engage to protect perception. Because your stability is internal, not external. This is psychological sovereignty. And sovereignty cannot be challenged easily. The strategic use of selective engagement. Psychological invisibility does not mean permanent silence. It means selective visibility. You engage only when engagement serves your objective. Never when engagement serves theirs. This is the difference between controlled action and emotional reaction. Reaction is automatic. Action is deliberate. Reaction is weakness. Action is power. Machiavelli believed rulers must choose their moments carefully. Because unnecessary engagement wastes authority. And wasted authority invites challenge. Tactical reinforcement, the 3 filters. Before responding to anything, apply 3 internal filters. First, is this response necessary? Second, does this response strengthen or weaken my position? Third, am I responding emotionally or strategically? If the response is emotional, do not respond. If the response weakens your position, do not respond. If the response is unnecessary, do not respond. Silence becomes your default. Action becomes your choice, not your impulse. The psychological isolation effect. Eventually, people begin to treat you differently. They become more careful, more respectful, more cautious. Not because you demanded it, but because your behavior trained them. They learn their emotional tools do not work on you. They learn their provocations fail. They learn their influence has limits. And limits create respect, even among those who never intended to respect you. The collapse of emotional leverage. Emotional leverage requires emotional access. Without access, there is no leverage. Without leverage, there is no control. Without control, there is no manipulation. You become immune, not because you fight, but because you no longer participate. This is Machiavelli's final defensive evolution. Not confrontation, not domination, detachment. Because the person who cannot be emotionally reached cannot be emotionally ruled. The final transition begins. At this point, you have learned to never react. You have learned to never explain. You have learned to ignore strategically. You have learned to become unpredictable, detached, invisible. But there is one final phase remaining. The phase where silence does not just protect you, it establishes permanent authority. Because when silence becomes identity, power becomes permanent. This is the final evolution. The stage where you no longer use silence as a technique. Silence becomes who you are. Not forced. Not performed. Not strategic. Natural. Effortless. Unshakable. And this is where Machiavelli's darkest truth reveals itself. Power does not come from what you do. Power comes from what you no longer need to do. The end of emotional reactivity. Most people spend their lives reacting. Reacting to criticism. Reacting to disrespect. Reacting to rumors. Reacting to rejection. Their entire identity becomes shaped by external forces. They are controlled without realizing it. Every emotional reaction becomes a string, and everyone around them pulls it. But when you stop reacting, the strings disappear. No one can pull what no longer exists. No one can control what no longer responds. This is freedom. Not social freedom. Psychological freedom. And psychological freedom is the foundation of absolute authority. The perception of emotional immunity. People begin to observe you differently. Not consciously. Subconsciously. They notice. You do not argue. You do not defend. You do not chase validation. You do not explain yourself unnecessarily. And this creates a powerful perception. Emotional immunity. You appear unaffected, untouched, unbothered. And this perception alone changes how people treat you. Because humans instinctively avoid trying to control what they cannot influence. The fear of the unmovable individual. Machiavelli understood this deeply. He observed that rulers who remained emotionally unmoved were rarely challenged directly. Not because they were physically stronger, but because they were psychologically unbreakable. Emotional reaction invites attack. Emotional stillness discourages it. Because attacking someone who does not react feels pointless, even dangerous. Silence creates psychological uncertainty. And uncertainty creates hesitation. And hesitation protects power. Tactical execution, permanent non-reactivity. At this stage, your objective is not to use silence occasionally. Your objective is to live in emotional discipline permanently. This means you do not react impulsively. You do not explain emotionally. You do not engage unnecessarily. Not sometimes. Always. Consistency transforms behavior into identity. And identity transforms perception permanently. People stop seeing your silence as strategy. They see it as nature. And nature is not questioned. It is accepted. The collapse of external validation. Something else begins to disappear. The need for approval. The need to be understood. The need to be validated. Because validation is dependency. And dependency is vulnerability. When you no longer require validation, you remove the final leverage anyone has over you. You become internally sufficient, internally stable, internally complete. And completeness cannot be manipulated. Because manipulation requires emotional gaps. And you have closed them. Strategic selective response, the final discipline. Understand this clearly. Never reacting does not mean never acting. Silence is your default. Action is your weapon. You speak only when necessary. You act only when beneficial. You engage only when strategic. Every word becomes intentional. Every action becomes calculated. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is impulsive. Nothing is emotional. This creates precision. And precision creates power. The psychological war. At this level, you develop an invisible barrier. People sense it. They feel it. Even if they cannot explain it. They feel distance. They feel resistance. They feel limitation. They instinctively know. Emotional manipulation will not work here. And because of this, they stop trying. Not because they chose to. Because they were conditioned to. By your consistency. By your discipline. By your silence. The identity others accept. Eventually, your silence becomes your reputation. People describe you differently. They say, he never reacts. He never argues. He never explains himself. They stop expecting emotional access. They stop expecting emotional control. They adjust their behavior automatically. Without confrontation. Without communication. Without effort. Because perception has already been rewritten. Machiavelli knew. Reputation is stronger than force. Because force creates temporary obedience. Reputation creates permanent submission. The internal reward. But the greatest reward is not external. It is internal. You experience calm. Permanent calm. Situations that once disturbed you no longer reach you. Words that once triggered you no longer affect you. People who once controlled you no longer influence you. Because your emotional state is no longer externally controlled. It is internally governed. And internal governance is absolute power. The final psychological reality. Most people will never reach this level. They will continue reacting. Continue explaining. Continue defending themselves emotionally. Continue surrendering their psychological authority. Without realizing it. Because emotional reaction feels natural. Silence feels unnatural. At first. But those who master silence master themselves. And those who master themselves cannot be mastered by others. The final warning. Understand the weight of this transformation. When you stop reacting, you will see people differently. You will see manipulation more clearly. You will see emotional weakness more clearly. And others will see something in you. Something they cannot influence. Something they cannot control. Something they cannot break. And from that moment forward, your power will no longer come from what you say. It will come from what you refuse to say. Your power will no longer come from what you do. It will come from what you refuse to do. And your dominance will no longer come from emotional force. It will come from emotional absence. Never react. Never explain. Just ignore. And watch how the world adjusts to you.